As an architect, I encountered Bill amongst other architects when I first got out of college. Bill was partners with a guy named Alan Liu. My father, Edwin S. Darden Sr., was an architect at the time. And there was a lot of really good architects around Fresno at the time, and the AIA was a strong unit at the time, and they were very professional, all these guys. And they really supported the profession, and they supported design, they supported growth of the young people. And Bill was one of those guys, but this group, for the most part, was older, was my dad's age. And Bill was somewhere between my group and he was in the middle there somewhere. So he was kind of spanning two generations. And so Alan Liu was a very talented designer and was winning a lot of awards. And all the AIA awards, Alan Liu's stuff was getting great recognition. He designed the airport and the Confucius Temple and things that were getting, a lot of recognition. Bill was known as a talented architect, and Alan was smart and lucky to bring him in as a partner. And they continued a practice that supported good architecture. I don't know specifically all the things that Bill actually worked on, but the firm continued to produce good architecture and continued to win awards. And every time as a young guy out of school, I was very interested in design and awards, and I'd go to these things, and it was always William Patnaude getting these things, and I wanted my name up there with him. And eventually we were successful, and I can remember when I got the Award of Excellence, we got the Award of Excellence for the U.S. Government Employees Credit Union, that Bill came over to me and said, "Well, Junior," he always called me Junior. He said, "Well, you finally got the big one." And you would think that was a friendly thing, but the way he said it was kind of patronizing, like, he's really still above me, you finally got the big one, but you got a long ways to go. And I think that Bill always had an air of confidence, if you want to call it that, and not arrogance exactly, but the air of confidence that a good architect must have and does have to take the constant hit and the challenge of continuing to do good architecture. One thing that I have always felt as a member of the profession is that Bill carried the torch for good architecture. Whether he was actually doing the designs or he was instigating that culture in his own firm, I felt his firm was always producing good work and always had. But the overriding things that I feel about Bill, as I have experienced architect, is that he did carry a passion for the profession. He was an example for others of us who wanted to be good architects and wanted to carry the profession. His work always had quality in it. It was always well detailed. It always paid attention to the small things that other architects who were doing the more or less developer type work didn't always pay attention to. But you can go to any one of his projects, any of the ones I've mentioned, any of the projects at the university, they all show that same quality in the work, in the details, and in the materials. He was also a guy that advanced new materials for our area, and contemporary design, such as the art museum, which at the time for a public building was a very simple building and not very expensive, but very well done, and did very much express contemporary architecture.
So, of course, Bill is best known for probably Fresno City Hall. And at the time, there was a huge debate in the community. People said it looked like a flying saucer, a spaceship. They also said it cost way too much money. And so Bill was giving a tour one day, and he had the ready answer for that. He said, "Look, this city hall is going to cost $135 a square foot. The county's new jail addition is going to be $176 a square foot. And look at that." I thought it was perfect. And, it reflected what he believed in was that a public building should be functional, it should inspire people, and it should also shape political discourse. And he believed a properly designed building would uplift that discourse. Bill wasn't just an architect. He was also a historian of Fresno. And the great thing was he wasn't a guy about dates and figures. He gave you the feel. And I can remember one time he was describing the great movie theaters that Fresno had downtown. And, this was in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, and of course in the 60s and 70s, they all disappeared. But he described walking into one of these theaters, and I don't know if it was the Warners or the Sequoia or where, but he said, the carpet was so rich, I felt like I was just sinking into it. And when you hear that, I mean, it just paints 1,000 pictures. And that's what made him such a great historian. He could talk about being on top of the Fresno Hotel and going up there to what he called the Belvedere. And I think that stands for Fairview, something like that. And anyway, he described being there and then looking and being able to see the mountains, just reaching out and touching them. And so that described Fresno in a different time, and obviously when our air quality was a lot better. So the thing about Bill is that he didn't suffer fools gladly. So if you were in the journalism business, you had to earn his trust. And for me, passing this, I call it little test, was really well worth it, because you could ask him on a project, does City Hall know what it's doing? And you could trust that he would give the honest answer. The other thing about him I think about is that he was on that committee, I think it was the committee to have the general plan when people wanted to put housing all the way to the San Joaquin River out there on the bluffs. And so he was part of that committee, and people talk about Fresno's northward growth and sprawl, but the line was held, and we don't have big housing developments down on the bottom of the San Joaquin River, and I think Bill had something to do with that.
I had the opportunity to work with Bill for many years in his role as campus master plan architect and as project architect. And I can tell you that his influence and his architectural knowledge made such an impactful difference at Fresno State. I don't think of a project that Bill wasn't involved with or didn't have an opinion about. And sometimes the opinions were positive and sometimes they were critical, as they should be, because he really cared about every project that was brought forward, whether he was the project architect or not, and really took the time and care and passion to ensure that it fit within the architectural vocabulary and campus master plan for all of the growth that was happening at Fresno State at the time, starting with the student union, university student union, the library, the Engineering East Edition, McLean Hall. I mean, his influence and then obviously all the smaller projects that his firm, even some of the interior renovation projects. The list of projects that we did with William Patnaude over the years was obviously vast, and the trust and confidence was always there, and knew that they would always, again, have the university or the stakeholders' best interests in any project that they did. And the team that we always worked with William Patnaude, were always the best. The firm always had just great professionals that we worked with, in addition to Bill and obviously Mr. Liu. I had the opportunity to first meet Bill when I started in 1983 in the facilities planning office. And I just remember, I think when he would first come into the office, just thinking, oh my gosh, who is that? You could his stature, just even when he walked in, his presence, you knew he was an architect, and you knew he knew what he was doing. But always so gracious and thoughtful. And here I am, getting now to go to project meetings or construction meetings, and he would always make sure. And I learned so much from him. And in some cases, I was the only female, maybe in the room, and then being a student, but yet being asked to take on more responsibilities. He always made me feel very comfortable, and always took the time to explain to me why certain decisions, or explain to me why this was, on a drawing this way, or the detail. And he, and then as my career continued at Fresno State, and I got to work with him, more closely in campus planning, and as I became the director of facilities planning, I relied on him so much. He was a trusted colleague, professional, that any challenge we had with any project, I knew I could call him and talk it through with him. I know the advice and guidance he would give me, even if he wasn't involved with the project or the issue. And I just have such great memories, and just think about him often as certain projects, or I walk by certain buildings and know his presence will always be there at Fresno State.
My earliest recollections were in the late 1970s when he and I were both invited to take a week-long Joseph Albers color class or workshop with an incredible local artist named August Madrigal. He taught Joseph Albers color theory back on the East Coast. He was particularly at the University of Connecticut in Bridgeport for many years. And I remember having a quick rapport with Bill because we both had such terrible humor. And we learned so much about color theory, and that really helped me in my work as a landscape architect tremendously. Around 1985, Bill and Ed Darden came to see me, invited me to lunch, and they wanted to discuss my coming on as the consulting landscape architect for Fresno State. At that time, the landscape architect named Jones was coming down from San Francisco. I had to fly down, and they wanted someone local who could be on deck and serve on the campus planning committee. So Bill and Alan Liu had been on that committee for many, many years, and I got to join that committee. I was attending maybe for 28 years before someone on my staff took over. And Bill never sugarcoated anything. I spent all my time trying to be tactful, and he was extremely blunt. But he helped guide the administration and facilities development and master planning of that campus in such a way that he was always the fall guy for the administration, and he didn't mind being the bad guy. So if something was very inappropriate or going in the wrong direction, Bill would shut it down right there. And everybody respected that tremendously, including me. Back in 1988, Bill invited me to join him as his guest with a dinner group that he belonged to called the Owls. It's not well known. It's a non-club. There's no membership. There's no constitution. There is one guy leading it called the Czar for Life, and that was Bill Patnaude, and he was brilliant. This group was started by 7 local guys in 1948. They get together once a month for dinner, and someone would deliver a paper they wrote, a serious paper, but it could be on any topic and it could be humorous. And after 3 meetings, Bill invited me, and the group invited me in membership in 1988. And I didn't really understand what an opportunity that was, but I was always very grateful to Bill for that opportunity, and still to this day, 28 years later. So Bill was a very loyal friend. If he was angry with you, he was a terrible adversary. He really had strong feelings about everybody, and fortunately, he was always my friend. He had a great sense of humor. He loved good food. We had many, many social events together. One time he invited 20 of us to a gourmet Chinese banquet at the Dynasty, world-famous restaurant in Hanford. I'll never forget the bird's nest soup. I think it's the only time I ate it. He was very generous and very hospitable, good company. He traveled the world. He really supported the local arts and culture and historic preservation. So he was a great architect, a great friend, a great intellect, and a man of many, many talents. And I always felt honored to be included as a professional associate as well as a good friend of his. And he'll be very, very missed.
In 1968, a little before then, my parents purchased a large amount of property from my grandparents in an area which is now known as Quail Oaks. It's in Academy. It's about 20 minutes east of Clovis.
In the foothills.
In the foothills. The property, majority of the property is pretty flat. Yeah, but in the upper area, the area known as the Upper 40, there were some hills and a lot of oak trees and a lot of granite, boulders, and my parents decided to build a house there.
And so they hired Bill Patnaude, and that's when he came into our life and became very instrumental in our lives for decades.
For decades, starting when we were children. We were 10, I was 10, she was 12. And Bill had just graduated from, or recently graduated.
He had moved from working in Santa Cruz and moved to Fresno and had joined Alan Liu, who was a family friend.
The first time that I remember seeing Bill was at the site, which we called Picnic Rock. And he, I believe he may have been camping out there.
He did stay all night. Alan made him stay all night, several nights, and he was not really an outdoorsy person, so that he could map out where the moon would shine during the evening, because it was cultural for Alan Liu to make sure that you could see the moon out every window at nighttime. And of course, Alan made Bill go camp out, not.
Yeah, I believe, yeah, that's probably.
That was probably the first time we saw him on site.
Was on the site, and so I remember seeing Bill, first time meeting him. He was moving from boulder to boulder to boulder, and I was 10, and he stopped for a moment, and he looked at me, and then he looked one direction, and then another direction, and then another, and then another, and then he looked straight up, and then he looked directly at me again, walked past me, patting me on the shoulder, saying, "Hey, kid," and just kept on going. And I didn't realize until many years later, when I was in design school, that what he was doing is, at that moment, he had his moment when he had designed the entire thing. He had visualized the entire project, and all he had to do was put it on paper and build it. He promoted thinking differently, thinking aggressively, looking at all of the options, understanding where you are and what you're doing. And which is amazing for a person of his age at that time. It was fun. It was a beautiful experience. It was a privilege living in the house. It was a privilege meeting him. It was a privilege to meet a person who understood what we would need in the future.
Not just our residents, but our lifestyle.
But our lives.
And our lives.
Bill Patnaude was a very colorful character. You always knew when Bill entered a room, he could be slightly intimidating and exhibited a gruff exterior at times. But in the parallel universe to this colorful character was this brilliant architect, someone who was very committed to details and high aesthetics. His projects were never trendy. They were always underlined with classic form. My involvement with Bill was when he enlisted our interior design firm to do a medical facility in Phoenix. And the collaborations grew from there. We worked on other medical facilities, residential work, and a performing arts center. And Bill was always very generous with his knowledge and really valued the team approach and allowed us each to bring our talents to the table. And he was very respectful of that. He allowed for openness of conversation if there were any questions, but really did allow our creativity to thrive and to flourish. Bill Patnaude has left us a strong architectural legacy in that he did such fine work and was so committed to and passionate about historical structures. A lot of his work revolving around that, which is so important to cities. And his legacy was left in the Central Valley, but also beyond to other parts of California, Yosemite, and other states as well. The City Hall for Fresno and the Madden Library, and so many other works of his. Those now will be the history of Fresno, and I think it would be very important to him to know that he is part of a more current history that will go on as part of his legacy.
The first time I ever met Bill was in 2002. I had just come to the city, and I had inherited 2 nasty projects, very contentious. One was about trying to preserve a PG&E building that was south of Fresno. So I must have talked to him on the phone, but at the meeting of the Historic Preservation Commission, which was held in the city council chambers, and it was kind of tense and whatever, as part of the public testimony time, Bill walks up to the podium and he leans in and he starts to speak in this amazing voice. And he could have been reading from the telephone book. It was just the most mesmerizing voice. He knew how to use his voice. And of course, he was rational and articulate and said all these perfect, wonderful things about why we should, save this particular building. And I thought right then and there, I'm in love. He was just a really articulate man who really was very, very knowledgeable and so important to Fresno. Well, Bill's legacy is, of course, his role as an architect of extraordinary merit, his role in historic preservation, and I think I also like to stress the fact that he brought with him the architectural design aesthetic from Berkeley. He graduated from UC Berkeley. I'm very proud of that. And he was part of a whole 2 or 3 generations of Berkeley grads, ongoing. Paul Halajian, of course, went to Berkeley, starting with Julia Morgan, who really helped design the city. And so I think there is a Berkeley aesthetic here, and I think that's kind of a neat thing to say. Well, I knew Bill mostly as a preservation architect or as a preservationist. Certainly he designed City Hall where I work, and I appreciate that and know about that and his work with hospitals, et cetera. But he was absolutely active, particularly early on, even before I came to Fresno, in the preservation movement. He advised and worked on Kearney Mansion, which of course is owned by the Fresno Historical Society, not owned by, used by the Fresno Historical Society. He completely restored a beautiful, 1904, 1907 classic revival home called the Rehorn Home that became his architectural offices, Patnaude and Liu. And so that was certainly part, and he lived in a historic home. He lived in an adobe. And so when I was working on the research on Fresno's adobe heritage, which is really fascinating to me, he very graciously showed me through his home. And of course, on the property is a pond, which was a borrow pit where they dug up all the material to make the adobe. So he lived preservation. And of course, the Fresno Morning Republican, where we're going to have the tribute to him, was his life work. Did a beautiful job on restoring that to become the downtown club. And Yosemite, he did a lot of work in Yosemite doing their master plan and their whole rehab and whatever of their historic buildings up there. So he was a huge figure in historic preservation in Fresno.
I met him as a high school student. I was in a design competition, and Bill was I think he was the president of the local chapter that sponsored the design competition. And I remember presenting my project to him and getting shredded. And it was a sort of humiliating experience. And I was familiar with his work. My father had a lot of dealings with architects in town. So I knew about him. I knew about many of the buildings he did, and I knew he was a luminary architect. So to get shredded as a kid who was interested in architecture by a local giant was humiliating, but it also, I guess it showed me that architects are different, that architects think differently, they speak differently, they think about different things. And I remember thinking, I can never do what that guy does. I could never do the kinds of work or figure out the problems that he addresses. And so it was kind of a defining moment for me. It just, sometimes people think of intimidation as a bad thing, but for me it was a good thing. It kind of helped me to realize that if you work hard and go above and beyond, you can achieve things you didn't think were possible. Bill was for years the campus consulting architect at Fresno State. The first commission I received from Fresno State was the Science 2 building on that campus. And so I go from being this high school kid, 20 years later, 25 years later, whatever, I'm now being selected by Fresno State to design a new building on the campus. So Bill would always sit next to the associate vice president at the head of the table. And it was clear that Bill ran the meeting and that Bill was the guy that everyone would look to when anything architectural was being discussed. So I'm presenting the building, the first time anyone is seeing the design concepts, and once again, I'm shredded by Bill Patnaude. So I realized that the best way to work with Bill was to work with Bill, not against Bill. So rather than sort of digging my heels in and fighting for what I thought was the correct design, I invited Bill to come into my office and have like a one-on-one personal critique with Bill. And so he graciously came to the office, and we spent maybe 2 hours going through the design, and he sort of grilled me on everything from why I did this to how are you going to build that. So we went from macro issues to micro. How are you going to put that together? And I noticed him sort of warming. He came in very kind of caustic, and by the end of the meeting, it was a very collegial interaction. And in retrospect, I don't think the design changed radically as a result of it, but the demeanor changed. I think as a result of that meeting, maybe Bill and I connected at a different level. Not only did he leave a body of work behind that is noteworthy, I think he made the time to elevate the entire profession. The fact that we had somebody from the San Joaquin chapter of the American Institute of Architects go on to be the state president and even the national president, that's huge. We're really, in the United States, the San Joaquin chapter is really not a big chapter. And for us to have somebody go as far as he did and actually be named a fellow in the American Institute of Architects, that's huge. So I think he impacted the profession, not just in Fresno, but in California. And the body of work that he did, not just in Fresno, but nationally, it's really remarkable that somebody from Fresno achieved what he did.
I met Bill actually in 1996, and Fresno Community Chorus had traveled to France in 1997. And the one thing that I remember Bill kept saying was, when you look at a building, don't just go into the building. Don't look at the footprint. Look up and look at the detail. Look at how it fills the space. Look at how the roof line and how it fits in with other buildings. And I never really thought of that before until he had mentioned that. And so from there, every time I would travel to any city, I would actually remember Bill's words, and I would always remember to look up. And I found out that there was so much detail and carvings in any building, and that's really where the beauty is. Well, there's so many stories, I'm not really sure where to start. But again, in 1996, when I joined Community Chorus, he also joined that year, and we'd started talking about when we each started singing. I started singing in high school, and he told me that when he was at Sanger High, he came across a teacher, Bob Bruni, who had told him to be in a musical. From there, he found his voice, and he was a bass. He then went on when he was at Cal Berkeley, and he sang in the Men's Glee Club. And then you fast forward to 1996, and he became a member of the Community Chorus, and you would always hear him humming or whistling any classical tune. One of his favorite arias was, I remember the Flower Duet from the opera Lakme. So he was really pretty much of a Renaissance man. I can deem him as that. He also loved to cook. He would have a pie party every December. He would bake his own pies. I wish I had the pie crust recipe. He had a love for animals. He loved dogs more than cats. He had a panache for fountain pens. And I don't know if anybody's told you those stories, but he loved a Pelican pen, and it had to be a certain nib. He would use primarily brown ink or sepia ink, and he loved calligraphy. He just pretty much was a man who could have interest in just about everything. So really enjoyed having him as a friend.
As a layperson, I appreciated Bill and others of his, I will say, creativity, who could be part of a design for City Hall or the airport, but yet had a passion and a love for not only downtown, but could take the Metropolitan Museum building and other older buildings, and with his genius and creativity, do, I think, equally as talented a job as he would with some that are more contemporary. So he was not a one-trick pony. You know, Bill was a complicated guy. Bill did not suffer fools gladly, and the rest of us sometimes fit into that category. He had a way of being succinct. Some would say direct. Some would say he could be a bit of a curmudgeon. But Bill Patnaude was a good man. Bill Patnaude was a good friend. He had a litany of interests. He was a gourmet chef, but particularly he was a pie chef. Every year, he would have a pie party at his home during the late fall of the year, and there would be literally 18 or 20 pies that Bill would have created, and we look forward to that gathering. The importance, I think, of that is to show, the term Renaissance man or Renaissance person is sometimes overused, but as Bill was a chorale singer of some considerable respect and talent. He was a gourmet chef. He was a collector of pens, and whether he would be classified as a world-class calligrapher, I don't know, but his hand, out of the architectural precision, was flowing and interesting. So it seems to me that when you think of Bill Patnaude, you think of someone who had a variety of interests and not focused only on one profession and perhaps one hobby. That friendship is a very rare thing when you get right down to it. If we are fortunate enough in our life to have a few folks that not only do we think are good friends, because sometimes they're not there when times are tough, but you find out folks, and Bill was one of them, that if you did have a challenge, Bill was your friend. And after all the buildings are recognized, after all the pies are eaten, the memory of a man like William Patnaude as a friend, I think, is an attribute that will outlive perhaps even some of his buildings.